weeks ago, but it's based on the book of 2 Corinthians. And so if you have your Bibles, I'd invite you to turn over with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 10 in our lesson this morning. And we're going to be talking about or studying about a preacher in paradise. Now, I mentioned on Sunday evenings some time ago we had a series going on the book of 2 Corinthians, and I've gotten up to chapter 11, so we kind of covered some of those things there a couple weeks ago. If you remember some of those principles, they'll help you through this chapter. But if you don't, I want to just kind of remind you a little bit of what's going on as Paul is writing this letter to the church at Corinth. This is a section here in chapter 12 that's kind of the peak of Paul's defense of his apostleship. If you remember when we studied chapter 11 a couple of weeks ago, he was trying to prove to the church at Corinth that he really loved them, that he genuinely cared for him. His apostleship had been called into question. His love for the church there had been challenged. And so Paul is basically writing a defense, trying to prove to these people that he is indeed an apostle of Jesus Christ, and that he does indeed care for them and has their best interest at heart. Now, the problem is that you read about the writings of Paul, and you know a little bit about the character of Paul. Paul was always hesitant to write anything personally about himself. Now, there were times when he did write things about himself, but he didn't want to call undue attention to himself. You know, whenever he had people reading these letters, he wanted them focused upon the glory of God and, giving all the credit to him. And so I imagine, I never sat through one of Paul's sermons, but I imagine if you did, you probably wouldn't hear him refer to himself very much in those sermons. I doubt that he would tell you a lot about his personal experiences or even some of the great achievements that he had been able to accomplish for Christ. He was just a person who didn't like to draw undue attention to himself, and so he was very hesitant to write anything about himself personally. But because of that hesitancy, these false teachers had made a claim against Paul. And basically they were saying, Paul is not a true apostle because Paul hasn't had some of the same spiritual experiences that we had. If Paul was really an apostle of Christ, wouldn't Jesus talk to him? Has he ever told you about the day that Christ talked to him? Now, we read in the book of Acts where he had to defend himself publicly, and he does relay some of those facts, but not in a way where you read in every epistle. He brags about having seen Christ, or he brags about having conversations with Christ, or even receiving visions, heavenly visions or spiritual visions from Jesus. And so basically they're saying his salvation, is he really an apostle? Is he really preaching the gospel of Christ if he hasn't had this heightened level of experience? And so how could he be this an apostle of the Lord if he hasn't had these great spiritual visions and revelations from God like we've had? Well, you can imagine, here's Paul. He doesn't like to do this, but he's in a situation where he's really left with no choice. He had to defend himself against what these people were saying because they were leading the church at Corinth astray. It was essential to these people's salvation, to securing their salvation, to getting them to hold on to the gospel of Christ. And so what he does in chapter 12, he does something that's very unique to his writings. He shares with us one of those spiritual experiences that he had in being an apostle of Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting is, if you've read this, and I assume most, if not all of us have, or studied it before, you know that he talks about it, but he really doesn't say anything. He kind of tells you about, well, I had this experience, but he doesn't give you a ton of details, and he doesn't give you a bunch of information. And even when he talks about it, he uses, or he's describing himself in the third person. He's not saying, I did this, or I did that, or this happened to me. He says, this happened to a man. And here's what happened to this man. And so you can see his great humility, even in describing this great experience that he had. He doesn't want to take anything away from the glory and the credit that belongs to God. And so what we want to do here, we want to look at these first 10 verses in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we want to talk about three different experiences that he had that are recorded here from God. The first one has to do with the idea of glory. God had honored Paul with a great experience. And if you know anything about, again, these false teachers, these Judaizing teachers that were troubling the church at Corinth, you know that they were all about honors. In fact, if you back up in chapter 3 and you read verse 1, remember there Paul asked the question, he said, do we need letters of recommendation like these other people? They were really big about honors to be had by men. And so you can almost imagine these people carrying around their stacks of letters, and showing, well, here's a letter of recommendation from Jerusalem. Or here's a letter of recommendation from the high priest. And so people would read that and they would think, wow, these must be great men. These must be important men. We need to listen to what they have to say because they have all these letters of recommendation. Paul said, do I need a letter to recommend me to you so that you guys will listen to us? Paul wasn't about honors to be had by men, but he was about honor to be had by God. And of course, that's really the only honor that matters in the end. But think about some unique things that Paul got to experience in this life that again showed a great honor that was bestowed upon him by God. Now you'll not read this within this chapter, these first couple ones, but I just want to kind of get our minds going down the same road and thinking about this idea. First of all, the Bible tells us that Paul saw the resurrected Christ. In fact, he wrote about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 8. And of course, he wasn't writing about it to brag, but he was writing about it to point out the resurrection was a reality. I saw Jesus Christ with my own eyes. And when you think about the resurrected Christ, exactly how many people did Christ appear to after he was resurrected from the dead? The answer is not a lot. Now, when you compare that to the number of people who were alive in that day and age, it's a significantly small number that actually saw the resurrected Christ. I don't know about you, but if I saw the resurrected Christ, I think I'd probably tell a lot of people about it, wouldn't you? I mean, it wasn't something that everybody got to see. It was a unique experience. And so God honored him by being able to see the resurrected Jesus Christ. Another thing that you'll find about is there were revelations that Paul got directly from Jesus himself. In fact, he talks about one of those in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 23. And remember, he's writing about the Lord's Supper. And he's telling the church at Corinth what happened on the night that Jesus was betrayed. Now, if you stop for a moment and you just think, where was Paul the night Jesus was betrayed? Well, I don't know for sure where he was, but I know where he wasn't. He wasn't in the upper room with the apostles. He wasn't sitting at the same table as Jesus when he instituted the Lord's Supper and gave all these instructions about it. How did Paul know about it then? He says in verse 23 of 1 Corinthians 11, he said, for I received of the Lord. In other words, this was something that Jesus himself showed Paul directly. Now, it wasn't something that he'd heard from an apostle. It wasn't, a second-hand account from a person who had passed the information on down to him. It was a direct revelation that was given to him by Jesus Christ as to what happened in that upper room the night that Jesus was betrayed. And so he has these places in his life where God appears to him and gives him directly a revelation of something that had happened along the way. Well, did everybody have that same honor in the first century church? No. Not everybody received revelations from God, but certainly Paul did receive his share. And the third thing that I want to emphasize is that he had multiple visions that came from God. Alliteration is reveries here, and you can look that up. Basically, it means a daydream or a vision. Paul, in fact, in this very chapter, he alludes to that in verse 7 of this chapter in 2 Corinthians 12. He talks about the abundance of revelations. There were times where God appeared to him in a vision and told him to do something or, gave him certain instructions as to where he was to go or what he was to teach or what he was to do. And you'll read about that numerous times. When he's standing before Agrippa in Acts 26 and verse 19, He talks about a heavenly vision that he received. We know when we go back to Acts chapter 9 that he saw a vision of a man named Ananias coming to him and laying his hands on him and receiving his sight. So he received this heavenly vision from God as to what would happen in the future. In Acts 16, he sees the vision of a man of Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us," which was indicative of his preaching the gospel over there. In Acts chapter 18 verse 9, he's in the city of Corinth, and Jesus appears to him in a vision and says, "Don't be afraid to preach the gospel in this city. I have many people who are here." He stays there a year and a half preaching the gospel of Christ. In Acts 22, again, he's talking about what has happened in the past as he's giving a defense of his life in the preaching of the gospel. But in verse 17, he talks about how he received a vision from God that told him to get out of the city of Jerusalem or else he was going to be killed. We also read later on in Acts 23 and verse 11, he's arrested in the city of Jerusalem. God appears to him in a vision. He says, "Don't worry about it. You're going to go to Rome also, and you're going to bear witness for me there too." In Acts chapter 27 and verse 23, he tells the people as he's on a ship that's headed to Rome, he tells the people that nobody's going to die. An angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a vision. Nobody's going to die, but the ship is going to be wrecked. And so what I'm emphasizing to you is, did Paul ever have any visions, heavenly visions from God? Abundantly, yes. It wasn't that Paul didn't have these visions. It was just that Paul wasn't the type of person who bragged about himself and the experiences that he'd had in this life. And so what we're getting down to here in chapter 12, I think, in my opinion, he saved the best one for last, but he tells us about a heavenly vision or revelation that has taken place in his life. And notice what he writes in verse 1. He said, "It is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one was caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter." There's a couple of things that Paul says. He doesn't say a whole lot about what went on. He just tells us about this incredible experience and vision revelation that he had. And one of the things that he wasn't sure of is, he said, "I don't know if I was in my body, if my spirit was in my body, or if my spirit was out of my body. I don't know if I was still alive." That would have been the implication, right? When the spirit's in the body, you're alive. What happens when the spirit goes out of the body? You're dead. He says, "I don't know how this happened. I don't know if I was dead or I was alive, but I was caught up into the heavens." Now, stop and think about that. And I know there's a lot of speculation about, well, when did this happen? And, what were the events surrounding it? And the simple answer is, I don't have a clue. I mean, I could speculate, but you could speculate too. And in the end, we won't know any more for reality as to what we read about right here. Because this is the only record that we have of what happened. And so I don't want for us to speculate and to think about this idea, but to think more about the point that Paul's making here. Paul is saying, I experienced the reality of the heaven of heavens. Can you imagine that? Now, Paul talks about being caught up into the third heaven. The Bible speaks of three different heavens. One realm that the Bible calls heaven, the first realm, is basically what we would consider our atmosphere. It's the air that we breathe. It's the clouds. It extends from the earth up to the stars. That's the first heaven. The Bible also talks about another heaven, and that would be like the celestial bodies. We might refer to it as the starry heavens. It's the place where we might say is outer space, where the sun and the moon and the stars go. And then there's a third heaven that's beyond the stars. And that third heaven is where God dwells. It's beyond this earth. It's beyond this atmosphere. It's beyond our outer space. It's in another world, so to speak. And I know that that's what Paul's talking about, because in verse 4, he says, this man was caught up into paradise. Well, what are we talking about here? We're not talking about our atmosphere. We're not talking about outer space. We're talking about the heavens of heavens where God dwells. And here's the amazing thing to me. This is the first time we've heard about it, and it happened 14 years before. Think about that for a moment. Paul had had this heavenly experience. He didn't know if he was dead. He didn't know if he was alive. He couldn't explain everything that was related to it, but he had been transported into the heaven of heavens where God lived. And for 14 years, he's never told a soul about it. Think about that. I don't know about you, but I'm just thinking as a human being and my personality. If I went to the heaven of heavens, I think I'd at least whisper to somebody about it, don't you? But 14 years, not a peep. A lot of times we say to one another and encourage one another, cheer up, one day you'll be in heaven. You imagine what Paul could have said? I've already been there. I already experienced it. I already know what it's like. And further, while he was there, we learn this in verse 4. He overheard a spiritual conversation. I don't know if he just overheard or if he was actually involved in this spiritual conversation. There was some kind of conversation that took place in heaven where either Paul was just listening to what was going on or he was actually engaged in this discussion. But he was not allowed to repeat one word of that conversation when he came back to earth. Now think about how hard that would have been. He says this in verse 5. He says, of such an one will I glory. Yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool. For I will say the truth, but now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seemeth to be, or that he heareth of me. The point that Paul's making here is, do you want revelations? Do you want spiritual experiences? Can any of these false teachers or Judaizers tell you they've been to the heaven of heavens? Because I have. I've experienced that myself. Well, that experience in and of itself would have made a lot of people proud. They would have immediately went out and told the world about everything that had happened to them. They would have wanted to been famous. How could Paul go through something like this and still remain quiet? And you know what the answer to that is? He was a humble man. He did not want people relying upon him for their salvation. He wanted them looking at God. He wanted them looking at Christ. He wanted them turning to the gospel. Not his spiritual experiences, but the gospel, the truth. He wanted God to be magnified, not his name. He didn't want to be exalted above men. But he was a very humble individual. And so there was a tremendous honors that were bestowed upon Paul. And I know as we read through the script, we're not even reading the half of it. There's no telling how many things happened to Paul that are not recorded for us. Not only did he experience glory, but he also experienced goodness. And he talks about how even though he had these amazing revelations and visions from God, God still helped him to remain humble. And so he says this in verse 7. He says, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Paul received some kind of physical ailment, some kind of thorn in the flesh that helped to keep him humble. Now, did that happen after he saw this vision of heaven or after he had this experience? Some people believe that's what he's saying. I don't know for sure. I just know this, that Paul says he experienced a thorn in the flesh. And I don't know about you, but when I think about a thorn in the flesh, I think about, a little piece of sharp object that's underneath your skin, and it hurts. I don't want to minimize it, but you leave it there long enough, it can get infected, it can cause some pain, right? That's not the word that's used in the Greek language here. The word that's translated as thorn literally means a sharp stick upon which people were impaled. Now, this is the idea that a lot of times when an army would go in and conquer their enemies, they would impale their enemies upon these sticks and they would hang them as public display for everybody to see. They're also, it's the same word that's used to describe the spikes, the wooden spikes or stakes that would be put in the bottom of a pit. If you were trying to kill an animal and you set a trap for an animal and you put those wooden spikes in the bottom of it and covered it up so that when that animal fell, literally they would be impaled upon that stick. Now, when you read that, to me, that gives me a little bit broader idea of pain than just the thorn in the flesh, doesn't it you? It wasn't just some little prick that Paul felt every once in a while on his finger. It was a tremendous pain that was being put upon him. What was that thorn in the flesh? Well, you can speculate all you want, and I can speculate too, and the bottom line is we don't know when we get done. All I know is it hurt. All I know is it was something that was allowed to, or Satan was allowed to inflict upon Paul, and it hurt him, physically speaking. Sometimes when we think about affliction, and we think about suffering, a lot of people think about suffering and affliction as being punishment from God. You know, when we do something wrong, God punishes us. That's why we're being afflicted. That's why we're suffering. But it's interesting, as Paul writes about it here, he talks about this thorn in the flesh. First of all, that's not accurate. It wasn't from God. It was from Satan. Satan was the one who was the instigator of whatever this pain was that Paul was experiencing. But God did allow Satan to inflict that pain upon Paul. And somebody looks at that and they say, why would God do that? You know, why would God allow Satan to inflict such severe pain upon a godly man, Christian man, an apostle of Jesus Christ, a spiritually minded individual? And the answer that Paul gives us is this: God knows how to balance us out in life. If the only thing Paul had ever experienced was all these glorious things, these revelations and these heavenly visions, and everywhere he went he experienced success, what do you think would have happened to Paul? Paul said, I would have got full of pride. I would have become a proud individual. And think about that as we go through life. What if everything that we experienced in life was only good? Nothing bad ever happened to us. Only blessings. Well, pretty soon we'd start feeling pretty good about ourselves, wouldn't we? Pretty soon our level of pride might keep rising and rising and rising until we just get to a point where we think we're the cause of everything good that happens to us and nothing bad or nothing can ever go wrong. Burdens help us to keep humble. And Paul understood that. But Paul understood that God was permitting Satan to buffet him for the purpose of him not being too proud. And that's what he says in verse 7. Lest I should be exalted above measure, because of all these abundant revelations that have been given to me. Then he talks about how there was given him a thorn in the flesh. And he talks about in the end of the verse, lest I should be exalted above measure. What did this thorn in the flesh do? It helped him to remain humble. You know, there are a number of reasons why we suffer. The Bible talks about how we suffer or we're afflicted because we're simply physical in nature. We're human beings. You know, the mystery of human suffering is never going to be completely or fully solved until this life is over. We'll understand it all then, I'm sure. But as far as the complete comprehension of everything that's happening, it's not going to go or work in this life. Here's the reality. Okay, we're physical beings. We're human beings. And as we grow older, our bodies grow older too. Because we're human, we're susceptible to sickness. Because we're human, we can have disease that comes upon us. Because we're humans, we're going to experience the normal problems of being a physical individual living here upon this earth. And there's only one way that you can escape that, and that's to not be human anymore. I don't think any of us want to take that route either, right? It's the suffering because of being a physical person in this world. It's just the reality. The second thing is sometimes we suffer because we're foolish people. And what I mean by that is we don't listen to what God tells us to do. Now read the Bible. Read about some great men and women of God. Think about David, a person who suffered greatly. Why did he suffer? There were a lot of things. You look at the life of David. He did not have an easy life here upon this earth. But some of the problems that he had were self-inflicted. They were because he didn't listen to God, because he disobeyed God. And there were painful consequences that came upon David because of that, because of the discipline of God. It's not a question of, will God forgive us if we do something wrong? We know he will, right? But here's what we understand. We also understand that as a faithful parent, God disciplines us. God disciplines his children. And God does not undo what we've done, the consequences of what we've done. In other words, there's this law in the Bible in Galatians 6 and verse 7 that talks about you reap what you sow, right? And the idea is if I do something, there are consequences that come back on me because of that. Can I be forgiven? Yeah. But it doesn't undo the consequences. And so we're going to suffer because of sometimes we're just too stubborn to listen to God. But we also learn this. We suffer sometimes in order to keep us from doing things that are wrong. And here's the way that Paul put it there in verse 7. Remember, he talks about lest he should be exalted above measure, lest he should become too proud. The thorn in the flesh was given to him. Think about this. To keep him from sinning. To keep him from becoming too proud of an individual. And so we know, it's not a study of pride this morning, but we know all the sin, or how many sins that pride can lead to. It can inflict a number of sins, a multitude of sins in our lives. But Paul says this, God permitted Satan to buffet me. That word buffet means to strike with the fist. It's the idea of being punched in the face. And again, don't think about it, it's just this little tap on the cheek that Paul was getting. There was something painful that was going along. Why was Satan using this thorn in the flesh? He was using it to try to discourage Paul, to try to get him to do something evil. But you know what God was using it for? He was using it for something good. He was using it to try to keep Paul from becoming overinflated, becoming too proud of an individual because of all these experiences that he'd had. And notice what he says in verse 8. He says, "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me." On 3 different occasions, Paul prayed for the removal of this thorn in the flesh. Now, was Paul sinning whenever he prayed for deliverance from this thorn in the flesh? No way. I mean, you think about it, that's the normal human response to pain and to sickness and to suffering, isn't it? When we experience pain, when we get sick, if we're diagnosed with a disease, aren't we going to pray to God to take away that sickness, take away that disease, to take away that pain, that suffering, whatever is causing it? That's what Paul did too. But the problem was this: it wasn't within God's will to take away that pain and that suffering because it was doing something positive for Paul. And Paul could see that. It doesn't mean that he enjoyed it, but he could see the good that was being accomplished by this thorn in the flesh that he had within this life. Again, people have this idea, this belief that affliction and suffering, if you're a Christian and you're being afflicted, or if you're a Christian and you're being suffering, it's because you're a disgrace to God. Well, Paul was no disgrace to God. Christ was no disgrace to God. But they experienced pain and suffering in this life. And so we're going to be sick in this life. It's just the reality of it. We can be affected by disease. Suffering is going to come our way. What was the good that came from this? It hampered Paul from becoming too proud of an individual. It kept him from falling into sin. Now, we don't always think of suffering that way, but I'm giving you a biblical picture here and an apostle explaining it to you. The third thing that I'll emphasize, he experienced the grace of God. And what I mean by that is God helped him. Notice 3 separate occasions he asked for this thorn in the flesh to be removed. And here's what God says in verse 9. He said, "My grace is sufficient for thee." See, instead of God answering this prayer that Paul offered up in the way that he desired, He was given a message of grace from God. And here's what God's message was. I gave you enough to make it through. Okay, you've got enough mercy, you've got enough grace, you've got enough unmerited favor that you can make it through this thorn in the flesh. You can overcome it. It's not going to tear you down. It's not going to bring you down. It's not going to destroy you. It's not something that you can't get over. I've given you enough grace that you can make it through this difficult struggle. Bottom line is this. We know that God never gives us suffering we can't handle. He never puts us in a situation where His grace is not enough. Now, God didn't give Paul a detailed explanation. He didn't go into this and say, well, here's what I mean by this. He just gave him a promise. He said, my grace is sufficient for you to overcome this difficulty that you have. And so think about the idea of the grace of God being enough. Sometimes, again, our prayer is get rid of the pain. Get rid of the suffering. Get rid of the sickness. Get rid of the disease. The answer is this: God's grace is sufficient. Whatever situation we find ourselves in, God has given us enough that situation will not destroy us if we'll just listen to Him and follow His plan. And so that's the answer that Paul received. It was a message of sufficient grace. It was also a message of saving grace. In the latter part of verse 9, he said, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon you. Paul had this deeper insight into what his pain was doing for him. It was a way, Paul saw it as a way to keep him from becoming too proud. And so how does that work? Because Paul needed God for this difficulty that he was experiencing in life. And what that difficulty helped him do was keep God in the forefront of his mind. Keep him being dependent. Keep him being mindful of God. And if the Bible teaches us anything, it teaches us this. If we're going to be strong, spiritually speaking, we need to be weak. We need to be humble individuals. And so suffering was not like this tyrant that was controlling Paul and putting him in a difficult situation, but he saw suffering as his servant that was helping him to keep God in the forefront of his mind, to keep him dependent upon God, and to keep him mindful of God. And so what he saw in verse 10 was a weakness, a physical weakness that had spiritual benefits. And so he makes this statement. He says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches and necessities, in persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. I want you to think about what he says here in verse 10. I take pleasure in infirmities. The reproaches that he had to suffer, the necessities that he lacked, the persecutions, the distresses that he endured. He took pleasure in those things. What does that mean? Does that mean that if Paul had a preference, he would prefer pain over health? Well, no. I don't think any of us would prefer that, would we? If we have the ability to choose. Doesn't mean that he was a guy who was psychologically unbalanced and he enjoyed pain. He got a thrill from pain. That's not what he's talking about there. He's talking about this idea that he understood there were spiritual benefits that came along with this physical pain, and the things that he got from it, the spiritual benefits that he received from this far outweighed the physical pain itself. Now that's an amazing way of looking at suffering and affliction, isn't it? But that's the way that the Bible teaches us as Christians that we should view it. Does it hurt? Absolutely. If we had a choice, would we choose it? Not in a million years. But understand the spiritual benefits that we're getting from it. And whatever physical pain we might be experiencing in this life, I'll guarantee you the physical benefits that we get out of it far outweigh any of the physical pain that we can suffer. If life were all blessings, we would all be very proud individuals. And so what we need from time to time is a dose of humility. We need a little bit of suffering in our life. That's the medicine that God prescribed to keep Paul humble. And it's when we are weak in this life that we're the strongest. It's when we have a need and a dependence upon God, and when God is in the forefront of our minds, that spiritually speaking, we are the strongest. God's grace is sufficient to bear the greatest suffering that we're ever going to encounter in this life. And so Paul endured suffering. The message for us is we can do it too.